Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cooperatives Building a Better World, the podcast brought to you by Co-op News magazine. I'm Colin Talbot, a retired but not retiring Professor of Government from the University of Manchester, and my co-host is,
Rebecca Harvey, I'm editor of Co-op News. Lovely to have you back again.
yeah, it's great to be here. Um, okay, we're going to talk mainly today around the current issue, although we tend to wander off a bit. Um, and particularly the number of issues that articles in the current issue that reference issues to do with cooperative culture and International Women's Day, which I think Bex wanted to say something about.
I did. Happy International Women's Day for Sunday for everyone. Of course, every day should be Women's Day in my view. I think there is still so much inequality, and that's one fantastic thing that cooperatives do is because they are one of the founding values is around this idea of equality. Co-ops are uniquely positioned to really push that agenda, which is fantastic. This issue, we've got a couple of brilliant stories that really highlight some of the activity that women cooperators are doing. And one of my favorite pieces in this issue actually is a piece we did looking at some of the cooperatives working with women in agriculture. As most of you, or most of the people listening will know, last year was the second International Year of Cooperatives. And actually, this year is the International Year of the Woman Farmer. And there is, of course, quite a brilliant cross section there. So what we thought we'd do this issue is do some case studies on some of the co-ops that are set up by and for, women working in agriculture around the world. So we've got some fantastic case studies from, Rwanda to Mali. We've got a lavender co-op in Turkey, and we've got a kind of a federation of women in agricultural food cooperatives in Spain. So there's a fantastic cross section here between women and agriculture. And this week, of course, is also the Commission on the Status of Women being hosted at the UN in New York this week. And the theme this year is ensuring and strengthening access to justice for all women and girls, which again I think it is something that cooperatives aim to do. So it's good to hear that this work is ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, well, just one quick comment on that, which is that one of the things that always frustrates me is during the Second World War in Britain, women took on all sorts of roles, including in agriculture, the Women's Land Army, and in my old industry in telecoms, they ran the entire telephone and telegraph network during the war. And then as soon as the war was over, they were all sacked and forgotten about. Very few people know that women ran those systems during the Second World War. But the article that jumped out at me on this in the current issue of the magazine was the one on Nepal and the intersection between cooperatives and caste culture, national culture, because I think it raises all sorts of interesting problems and issues. Um, Essentially, the story is that although Nepal has attempted to eliminate caste culture, and even made it illegal to discriminate in all sorts of ways. It's lingered on for 60 years since the legislation was passed, and this is fairly typical of a number of Asian countries, most notably India, of course, where the caste system still operates. And women tend to end up in those systems, not even second class citizens, little third or fourth class citizens in some cases. But the articles about how agricultural co-ops, in terms of growing and distributing agricultural products, can actually act as a sort of counterculture and undermine the regressive national culture around caste and provide some contact between women from different castes. And I thought that was really interesting. It's not an overall solution to the problem by any means, and it's still, still a major issue. But I thought that highlighted that one of the ways in which actually, in a much broader sense, cooperatives can actually begin to change national cultures. And I think there's lessons from that, not just about caste system and women, but for more general things about how to change how to change society and make it into a better society.
I completely agree, Colin. And a shout out to the journalist who wrote this piece. Actually, it's a woman called Sharmila Thakuri. She's the founder and president of Nepal's Female Economic Journalists Association. She's a brilliant woman, absolutely fantastic. But what really struck me was the way that she ended the piece, where she was talking about how co-ops are brilliant. Change makers in terms of economic empowerment, but actually that doesn't necessarily translate into, cultural change immediately. So it's kind of like what you're saying, Colin, that this does start the work but doesn't finish it. Another shout out actually would be another brilliant women-led cooperative that also is based on the caste system. And this co-op is called, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but it's Kaiba Laharia. And it's a woman, well, it's a Dalit woman-led newspaper set up in India. And actually, a film was made about it called Writing with Fire. And it was the first Indian feature documentary to be nominated for an Oscar. And that was back in 2021. So it's a fantastic film if anyone gets to find it. I think it's on YouTube, or it was at one point.
Yeah, that leads us on to discussion about where co-ops fit into national culture, not just cooperative culture within cooperative organisations. Um, and you wanted to lead on to talk about some of the impacts that it's had on aid, the relationship between aid and cooperative development.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've spoken to Paul Hazen before. So Paul's a really interesting man. So Paul leads the US Overseas Cooperative Development Council, and prior to that, he used to lead NCBA CLUSA, which is the US Federation of Cooperatives, and he sat on the board of the International Cooperative Alliance. So he's done a lot of work at the lobbying, political with small p and big P level. Um, OCDC had most of their funding from USAID, from USAID. And of course, last year there were huge cuts across this. And it was a really tricky time. Like, everyone from USAID, no, sorry, excuse me, everyone from OCDC had to be made redundant. And Paul stayed on to see what could be salvaged. And it was an incredibly difficult time because overnight, all the overseas cooperative development work that was being done by cooperatives based in the US was cut. And so many fantastic projects were cut overnight. It's a really awful situation. But the silver lining is that in 2026, lobbying from OCDC, from NCBA CLUSA, and from other cooperative actors has resulted in the fact that actually the Co-op Development Programme has been included in the 2026 Fiscal Appropriations Bill. So the current Trump administration is going to be funding some cooperative development. And, I had a really great chat with Paul because I think one of the things that he really emphasized was the fact that cooperatives have this massively bipartisan appeal, or multi-partisan even. He was saying that he can really make the case for cooperative development, for cooperatives, on both sides of the political spectrum. He say he can make the argument to, excuse me, progressive Democrats that, cooperatives are inclusive, they're brilliant, they're ethical, they bring people together. But at the same time, he can also speak to the conservative Republicans and say, well, co-ops are a way for a person or a group of people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. They can, make something of their life by using this model. So I asked him, what was your argument for the Trump administration? Because obviously that's a whole different ball game at the moment. And his answer was that they had the research and the data that basically showed that in countries where US had done cooperative development work with different communities, there was better business, there was better trade, and people were less likely to migrate.
Right.
And this really resonated with the Trump administration to the extent that this development program has been included in the fiscal appropriations bill. He did say that actually getting the funds released is going to be, the next tricky part, and they're already working on the 2027 fiscal appropriations bill. But it does mean that actually that there is silver lining. But I think this idea of co-ops being multi-partisan is hugely interesting, especially, given what's going on in the rest of the world, in the UK political and climate, and just what you're saying as well, Colin, about culture. Like, what is a cooperative in terms of how do people take the values, take the principles, and apply them to their own situation, to their own context, to their own education?
Yeah, can we come back to that in a minute? There's one other
Yeah.
thing I wanted to pick up from the that article, which is I found really surprising, was that the USAID provides a lot of the infrastructure for aid distribution in different countries. I would have assumed, wrongly, obviously, that the transportation infrastructure and distribution infrastructure would have been run by international multiple
No, no.
multilateral organizations, and they're not. And that actually is one of the biggest areas of damage that's been caused by the withdrawal of USAID funds.
Absolutely. I mean, Paul was saying that, if country A wants to give some food to country B, they use the infrastructure provided by USAID. And the scariest thing about all of that was that he said that, the full effect of this hasn't come into force yet, because there are some funds that are still being used up, but it'll come to a point, I don't know, I'm not going to speculate on how many months or even years this will take, but a point that there will be no money for this infrastructure. And what happens then?
Yeah, no, that's very worrying.
If you're enjoying this podcast, why not consider becoming a member of Co-op News? As well as writing and talking about co-ops, we are a multi-stakeholder cooperative ourselves. For individual membership, visit thenews.coop/membership. Or if your organisation would like to become a direct member, email membership@thenews.coop to find out more about joining the heart of the co-op conversation.
So if we go back to this issue about where co-ops fit
Mm.
politically across the spectrum and how they can appeal to different groups, I find that really, really important because it's pretty clear. If you look in the UK, for example, in the last 10, 15 years, co-ops have been promoted both by the Labour Party, which in 2019 adopted this policy to double the size of the cooperative mutual sector, by the Liberal
Hang on,
Democrats.
sorry. I don't think was it 2019?
Yeah,
Oh, that far long ago. Okay.
yeah. It was when Corbyn was in charge of the Labour Party, and it was people from the Cooperative Party talking to John McDonnell, who was the shadow chancellor at the time.
Okay, fine.
Um, so the Labour's promoted them, the Dems have promoted them. Even the Conservative Party has actually promoted cooperatives. Now, I mean, it's controversial because uh, a lot of the trade union movement think that, but because the Conservatives were promoting cooperatives, basically turning public services into cooperatives, independent cooperatives. That was a form of privatization, according to some in the trade union movement. But nevertheless, they were appealing to those sorts of ideas. And in Britain, it goes back to David Cameron's ideas around big society, and even further back than that to Edmund Burke arguing for the little platoons that were the glue that held society together. And we'll come on to that a bit later when we talk about social clubs. But I think cooperatives are very interesting because they're sort of horizontal and they cut across the normal political silos, and can actually appeal to all sorts of different. I mean, obviously there are some they don't appeal to. Some extreme individualist libertarians are not very interested in cooperatives, and some at the other end of the political spectrum, died-hard state socialist people think cooperatives are pernicious. But they can actually appeal to quite a wide spectrum of people.
They can. I heard a story the other day about how actually the first cross-party group on cooperatives in the Welsh Senedd was chaired by a Conservative. The Tory party, we've got Conservative members and readers, that are very, very welcome at Co-op News. And it's definitely not just the purveyor of the Labour Party. But of course,
No,
in the UK, that this is confused slightly, partly because for historical reasons, we do have a cooperative political party, but it's always had a electoral agreement with the Labour Party. And this was discussed at Future Co-ops, which is a conference I went to a couple of weeks ago. And it's a brilliant event. It's hosted by Future Co-ops, which is a co-op development agency led by the brilliant Jo White, another fantastic woman. And what was really interesting about this event was that it was actually hosted well, it began on the day after the Denton and Gorton by-election. So, for viewers not in the UK or listeners not in the UK, Colin, do you want to give a little bit of context about that?
Yeah, Gorton and Denton's a largely working class area on the east side of Manchester. I actually lived there in the 1970s. Um, and it was a safe Labour seat. It was won this time by the Greens, and there was a three-way contest really between the Greens, the Reform Party, the populist right party, and the Labour Party. And although it wasn't quite as close as some people predicted, the Greens won with about 40% of the vote. It was quite an interesting split in the constituency. Um, and it's catapulted the Greens in particular into much more national prominence, which again is interesting because we had you had an interesting article from Molly Scott Cato, who used to be a Green MEP in a previous issue of the magazine,
Mm.
who's always been a strong promoter of cooperatives. And as you say, because the Co-op Party is tied into the Labour Party, I should confess at this point I'm a member of the Co-op Party, but not of the Labour Party. But because the Co-op Party is tied into the Labour Party, it sort of excludes in a lot of the policy discussions people in the Lib Dems and even people in the Tories who are interested in promoting the cooperative side of society. And I think that raises some important issues for us.
It really does. And I know you said it was a three-way race, Colin, but actually one of the fascinating stats to come out of the Gordon and Denton and Gordon by-election was the fact that the combined Labour and Conservative only had 26% of the vote. You know,
Yes.
the Conservatives lost their deposit, and that had been a Labour seat for 100 years. And I guess that was one of the main themes that kept on coming up at the Future Co-ops conference is where should co-ops be, or who should co-ops be working with to build strength, to build political strength, to build, economic and policy support within government. And the people at the event were a fascinating mix of, Green supporters, Green campaigners, and then people who were staunch Labour and cooperative supporters. But I think what really came out of it, out of the conversations, was the fact that, multiple things can be true at once. You could be quite angry at some of the more recent Labour policy. You can be grateful that they are still developing this, doubling the size of the mutual co-op and mutual economy and really putting in place some quite rigorous policies and legislation around that. And then also support some of the more ethical alternative green policies and green ideas around certain types of legislation. So all these multiple things were were being discussed at the Future Corps conference, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens next. I'm actually having a conversation this week with Joe Fortune. Joe is the Secretary General of the Co-op Party, so I'm going to be putting some of these questions to him as well, and I'll be fascinated to see what he thinks the future of the Co-op Party is going to be, where it's going to head, and also how co-op values and principles, and particularly cooperative values and principles, can align themselves with so many other different parties. Because there are some really great APPGs, the all-party parliamentary groups, on various subjects around cooperatives. So you've got the APPG on mutuals, you've got one on credit unions, and you've got one on cooperative community and social economy as well. And all these APPGs bring together a fascinating group of people who really do want to promote cooperation, when and where they are.
We should just explain APPGs are all party parliamentary groups in the
Mm.
UK Parliament who involve members right across the political spectrum, usually. And the three that Becky mentions are all cross-party, and although I think all three of them are actually chaired by people from the Labour Party. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
actually.
some of those are the other peculiarity in the UK is we have Labour MPs and we have Labour and cooperative MPs, and there's about 40 of those in the current Parliament, which is the largest number ever, which is quite a change. Um, we could go on, I think, to. Oh, sorry. One other thing I wanted to add in at that point as well. One of the developments that's new is that our cooperative apex organisation in the UK, Cooperatives UK, has opened itself up to individual members for the first time. So it's not just cooperatives and mutuals that could be members of Co-op UK. Individuals can join. And we recently had I'm one of them, and we recently had the first meeting of individuals with Rose Marley, the Co-op's UK. What is she?
Executive.
Chief
Yeah.
executive. That's it. Um, and one of the things that I was saying at that was that actually Co-ops UK is probably one of the main policy generating hubs in the UK for cooperative policy to push towards the government and other political parties.
Mm.
Um, so, for example, they published a really interesting proposal just in the last week or so to turn the BBC into a cooperative and mutual type structure and take it out of the hands of the government. So it's no longer a publicly owned broadcaster, which causes a lot of confusion internationally. I know people think it's a state broadcaster when it's not, which I thought was a quite a good proposal.
Mm. I think the idea of kind of community ownership of different assets is absolutely fascinating. And actually, just go back to the Future Cults conference really quickly. It was a fantastic presentation by a guy called Andrew Fowler, who's a research associate at More in Common. So, More in Common is a kind of research group, policy advocacy group, set up in the wake of the murder of British MP Jo Cox, which is an awful, awful time. And in her maiden speech, she basically said, we have more in common than divides us, which I think is, a fantastic sentiment at any time, but especially at the moment when our world is so divided. But last year, More in Common released this report called Shattered Britain, and it's got some really fantastic insights. But one of the things that he was talking about, that Andrew was talking about, was about how integration is so important in understanding social cohesion. But it also, as part of that, that integration can be achieved by restoring pride in local communities and the environment. And this is a direct quote from something he said. And he said, when we spoke to people about what made them most happy in the place they lived, it was nature, it was their local environment, and it was access to good quality parks. Community-owned assets are extremely popular, and community respect is central to rebuilding trust. And I think, cooperatives has such a vital role to play in this area.
Yes, and in the UK, I think that's going to be important for the new towns proposals that the Labour government are pushing ahead with, and for their big Pride in Place initiative, which is
Mm,
about redeveloping local areas. Which actually brings us on neatly to the final main issue we were going to talk about, which is civic institutions, which create a cooperative culture in a locality. And one of those important one is the idea of social clubs. Social clubs, there's a good article in the thing about with quite a lot of discussion with Johnny Gordon Fairley, who's prominent in the movement to try and reinvigorate social clubs. Social clubs developed in the 19th century as things like working men's or community clubs, sometimes around political parties. So there were Labour clubs, there were some cooperative clubs, and Tory Conservative Party clubs as well. Um, and by the beginning of the 20th century, there was something like, I think it's 4,000 clubs across the UK, which usually had their own premises and were member-run institutions. And they involved about 4 million members.
mm,
Um, by the late 20th century, that had dwindled to about 1 million members and only about half the number of clubs, just under 2,000. But there's quite a strong movement now to start reinvigorating them. And again, I think it fits quite nicely into the space across the political spectrum where they could be supported by people from all sorts of different political traditions and none. Um, and with there's certainly quite a few of them around still. I live in Bedford. We've got North End Social Club here, which is one of the few that are left. Um,
mm,
and they're really useful institutions. The only thing I'd add to the list of things that they do, which is in the article, is that we could have used them much more extensively during the COVID epidemic and now afterwards as well for people who are working from home. A lot of people
mm.
who've adopted distance working, which can be a very good thing in certain jobs, are stuck with having to work from home where they haven't really got the right conditions to be able to work from home. Whereas, people from my estate here, a lot of them commute into London. They could nip down to the social club during the day, meet other people, work, have
Mhm.
facilities like printers and good broadband and all that sort of thing. It would be quite an interesting innovation to start using them in that sort of way.
Absolutely, and that's how they were always supposed to be used, wasn't it? Because, they
Yeah.
weren't just places to go and have a drink, as I think some people might think, but they were spaces where communities were educated, where people could get together and organize for better conditions, where people celebrated, they held weddings, they held funerals, they really forged the solidarities that underpin trade unionism and cooperation. And it'd be great to see more of those coming into the 21st centuries. And the stuff that Johnny and the team at the Centre for Democratic Business are doing some fantastic stuff there. And what's also interesting is the political engagement that they've got. So they're doing a lot of work with the Co-op Party again, and with a group of MPs, including Stella Creasy, Stephen Doughty, and what's her name? I can't remember her name. Kirsty McNeil. So she's the Labour and Co-op MP for Midlothian, who's really spearheaded some of this work. So again, driven by cooperatives, but it could have such wide-reaching benefits for the whole of society.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember back in the 60s and 70s when local social clubs were really influential in their local areas and quite big. I mean, they've dwindled a bit now because partly encroachment by private sector actors like bingo halls and those sorts of people, and partly be just because people don't tend to go out quite as much as they used to now they can drink at home.
Mm.
Um, but they were really big and really influential, and I think they probably could be again.
I think adding to your bit about working from home and using these spaces for labour reminded me another article that's definitely worth checking out in Co-op News is they I did an interview with a fascinating professor called Dario Azzellini. So he's a senior researcher at the Institute for Sociology at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and he used to work in Mexico and he's worked in Cornell University, and he is super interested in the idea of worker self-management and how actually labour is, and cooperative labour in particular, is absolutely should be the centre of any kind of development. And he's just got a new book out. And the book is called Commoning Labour and Democracy at Work. And yeah, he really looks in particular at what he calls worker recuperated enterprises, which is a form of worker self-organisation where workers have basically taken over a failing business. And we talked about it briefly, I think, last episode, Colin, with the Marcora Law, which is mentioned
Yeah,
in Bruno Rowlands's book, which is the law in Italy, which gives and supports workers in an organisation to basically rescue the organisation. And his book's fascinating, and it includes a ton of case studies, ranging from an Argentinian lab doing COVID tests to a fully working shipyard. And one thing that he said was that through doing this book and through the research, he said that what this shows is workers can take over and can manage the production of anything, anywhere, everywhere, always. And I think that that's a super interesting way to put it.
yeah, it's a counter to the idea that cooperatives, because when we talk about cooperatives, the first thing people think about is shops and consumer
Yeah.
cooperatives. But actually, worker cooperatives, I mean, if we go back to this whole issue about cooperative culture, for me, cooperative culture is not just about values and principles, it's about practice.
Yeah.
How cooperative are they in practice? And by definition, if you've got groups of people working together for 35 or 40 hours a week, they've got much more scope for developing their cooperative ideas and practice than they have if they are just nipping into a shop 2 or 3 times a week to pick up their shopping, and have a very, very tenuous relationship with it's still cooperative, but it's not the intensity of relationship that you get with worker-owned cooperatives and businesses. The only thing I'd say about I said this about the Macora law as well, is there is a danger of taking over businesses which are, well, first of all, they're either failing because they're not actually very good businesses in the first place, and that might be problematic. Or secondly, they're in sectors which are actually in rapid decline, and that's one of the things that happened in Britain in the 1970s when the Labour government was promoting cooperative workers' ownership of various businesses. like in the car industry, for example, and one or two other sectors. But they were in decline. The sectors themselves were in decline. So it was almost you were being set up for failure. And I think one of the interesting things about worker co-ops now, I don't know what the stats are, but it would be interesting to try and find out how many of the new worker co-ops that are appearing are actually in new industries. There's certainly in the digital sector and the creative sector, uh, digital and creative sectors. There's a lot of worker-owned co-ops being set up by young people who don't want to work on their own, but also don't want to be part of some giant corporation producing this stuff. And I think that's probably going to be one of the most interesting areas, both economically and culturally, about the development of cooperatives in the future.
I think it's not just in the internal culture either. One of the other things that Dario Azzellini said was that, once workers are in control of the workplace, they're also much more likely to engage in questions around the ideas of ecology and sustainability. And these ideas become much more important. There is, of course, this tension as well between kind of worker cooperatives and employee-owned cooperatives, which are slightly different. And there's been some fantastic examples of fairly big brands doing this. And actually, the most recent one that we know of is Lucy and Yak, which is a British clothing brand. And the owners, Lydia and her husband, whose name I can't remember, have decided that they want to step away from the business and they are giving it to the employees. So we'll be running a Q&A with Lydia in the next issue, which should be really interesting. But what you're saying about being in the UK is also fascinating because one other thing that Daria said was that actually all this worker recuperation is more successful in Latin America. Rather than Europe, because what they do is respond to immediate needs. And I think I'll end on this quote because I think it's something that everyone around the world could learn for, is that we need to learn to respond to the needs of people and to solve issues. And, co-ops are good at doing that, and we need to do it better and quicker and more often.
I think that's a good point to end on. I look forward to the next session and the next issue of the magazine.
Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Have a lovely week and keep on cooperating.